Hey guys, boy has it been amazing to learn about St. Francis this month. We are learning about St. Francis of Assisi, and we still have boxes available for sale with gifts that come with about St. Francis. And let's just learn about who St. Francis was. St. Francis is known as a peacemaker. He's the patron saint of ecology and the animals and birds and plants, and that's what he's known for. And he's become popular in culture. People have put up their St. Francis bird bath with little birds, and so he's become as a hero for many people. But St. Francis was more than just that. He was a follower of Christ, and he was truly a lover of the gospel of Christ. And that was part of the motto, to follow the gospel. So St. Francis of Assisi, he wrote the Canticle of Creatures, which was really, it talked about man, but it didn't talk about man. It talked about man indirectly, but because he was talking about the sun, the fire, the wind, and the rain, all of these elements of creation, and how it praises God. It praises God by being itself, by being its true self. So like the fire praises God by giving warmth, and so forth. And so he brings that to the man and says basically that man gives praise to God by becoming his true self. And St. Francis believed that his true self was a peacemaker, a man of reconciliation. So St. Francis was born in 1182, and he died in 1226 at the age of 44 years old. His father was a prominent businessman who traveled to Italy and France, and St. Francis traveled along with him a lot of times to these places. And so actually St. Francis, his baptismal name was actually Giovanni, but yet they called him Little Francesco, or Little Frenchman. And a lot of scholars have debated that this is probably because the culture of France had impacted him so much, so they called him Little Frenchman. He was a knight, and he was in the Battle of Collistrata, and he had dreams of being valiant and doing great things. Well, he ended up becoming injured, and for some accounts say that he was near death. And during this time there were wars between Assisi and Perugia. And if you can imagine, there's just towns right next to each other that were at war, and sometimes these wars could get really brutal and ugly. And could you imagine fighting your next door town? So St. Francis, one day, whenever he was riding around, he encountered a leper. And this was the very pinnacle, the time when he changed dramatically. He had a conversion experience. And most of the time beforehand, St. Francis would have rode off away from the leper in fear. He would have probably held his nose in disgust of the smell. But for some reason, St. Francis, in this moment, he decided not to run away. And he embraced the leper and and actually touched the leper, which was unheard of. And it was an amazing witness that what St. Francis would later say was, "What was bitter tasted sweet." So he began to meet God in his life, and thus he began to meet God in the leper, and he began to meet God in the other people that he would serve. In 1208 was really the beginning of the Franciscans. Brother Bernard was one of the first brothers that came to him, and he always talked about Brother Bernard and said that, you know, that he would be the one that he loved above all the Franciscans because God gave him first. And it really was a testament that he wasn't called to live this life alone, but that he was called to live this life in community. So what happened was Brother Bernard and Francis, they opened up the gospel 3 times. And this is a practice that's called Sortes Apostolorum. And they opened up the gospel 3 times, and they read 3 passages of scripture that would truly mark St. Francis and his life, and even Bernard. And these words would really come to them. And one of the gospel readings was talking about, if you want to be perfect, go sell everything and you will have riches in heaven. Another passage, take no gold, no silver or copper coins, no sandals on your feet, no robe. And the last one he talked about was, if any of you want to be my followers, you must forget yourself and take up your cross and follow me. So these became really foundational pillars to St. Francis and the Franciscans. And they began to take these and to really live out the gospel. Francis, in a time when there were a lot of priests that were living in luxury in monasteries and the sorts, he was really a reformer, and he really wanted to change that aspect and to live in poverty and in simpleness and in peace. So he took the gospel to heart and really believed to take a spirit of poverty upon him. Then Peter Catani joins them, and now there were 3, which was important because because God is a Trinity, and now that they have 3 people, it kind of reflected this community that God, who is a Trinity, being of 3 persons in one being, he now reflects that in the community of St. Francis, Peter, and St. Bernard. So what happened was that they found a hut, and St. Francis even says that it's easier to live in a hut and go to heaven than to live in a palace and go to heaven. So after that, a little while, they stayed at St. Mary of Angels, and then at Rivo Torto. And what did they do during these times? Well, they basically preached. They went around and they talked to people about the gospel, about Jesus Christ, and this really shows how much Jesus really meant to these early Franciscans. And what was important was not only going out and preaching, but also coming back and talking about it. So they always had a tradition of going out and preaching the gospel and then coming back and saying, what did we experience? What kind of things did we learn? And they really refined their tactics, and it was a very beautiful to reminisce on what had experienced. One of the requirements that St. Francis decided for all these new incomers was that they had to work with the lepers for 1 year. And if they succeeded, it meant that they could live this kind of life. And so they continued on. The early Franciscans, they took odd jobs. They went out in the fields, and they were laborers. And they didn't take more than what they needed for 1 day. Can you imagine taking and stockpiling things that you need, the necessities of life, no more food than what you need for the day? That's a truly a big, profound faith in knowing that God will provide. And they went around, if they needed to, they begged, and St. Francis was saying that being ashamed to beg was actually an enemy of salvation. So they weren't afraid to beg if they had to. And then at one time they had 12 Franciscans that were with them, and they went to talk to Pope Innocent III, and during that time when they were walking over there, St. Francis decided, we need somebody to represent us and to be the leader. And so Bernard becomes the first superior of the order at that time. And St. Francis began to talk about Bernard, and he famously and prophetically talked about how Bernard would be tempted by the worst of the demons, but then in the end he would succeed and he would overcome these temptations, and that he would find peace. And all of this that St. Francis talked about Bernard came true, and in the end, after Bernard died, there were many miracles and beautiful miracles, and so St. Francis was a kind of prophetic person as well. In 1212, the rule was approved, and then after that, there's a few more Franciscans that would join them, and one among them was Leo, and Francis was really close to Leo. Brother Leo was a man that was known for his purity and simplicity. And St. Francis wanted him to be his confessor. So St. Francis had Brother Leo as a confessor, and St. Francis called him God's little lamb. So around that time, in 1212, St. Francis meets Clare, and Clare would end up becoming the leader and superior of the Poor Clares, which took upon the same spirituality as St. Francis of Assisi. And St. Francis, when he met Clare, he took her immediately to San Damiano. And he realized this because there was a papal bull that nobody could touch her because this was a place of sanctuary. So he took her there. And Francis loved St. Clare. And they talked often, and they discussed many matters throughout the years. St. Francis calls her my little plant. And St. Clare was, unlike St. Francis, St. Clare was very educated, and she knew Latin, and her Latin was very excellent. And she even wrote her own rule, which was unheard of. She was the very first woman to write a rule for their community, and that was saying a lot. And then in 1220, there were about 5,000 brothers that came, and they elected a new superior, because after Bernard was superior, then they changed it, and during this time, they had all these brothers that were living amongst each other. And what was really interesting was that the Franciscans were unlike other orders and other places of social interaction, because back then, when you were of a certain social class, you had to dress as that social class. So even in certain orders, if you were a slave, you had to dress differently than a person of a nobility, even though they were both monks of some sort. Well, not with the Franciscans. The Franciscans, they all dressed the same, and they really stressed brotherhood and becoming a community of brothers that broke all these barriers of social class difference. And St. Francis was known for those kind of moments of breaking those kind of barriers between, whether it's barriers of religion and belief, such as when he met the Sultan. There was a war that was going on between the Muslims and the Christians, and St. Francis defied all those odds, and he went and he met the Sultan, Now, he took a brother, and they went in the middle of a battle, and they went directly to the Sultan, and they were almost killed by the guards, but the guards kept him alive and brought him to the Sultan, and they had a discussion for many days about religious topics and about who God is and those sort of things. So St. Francis definitely defied being a person that didn't care about about social class or religious differences. He always sought and to look and see Christ in another person, no matter who they were. So they were unlike other orders where, like for example, the Benedictines, they had a stability because they were tied to a monastery, and they had a stability there. The Franciscans, on the other hand, were a moving rule where they would move from place to place. And one day, St. Francis went to the cave, and that's where he ended up writing the rule. And only Brother Leo and Brother Boniface were allowed to come and visit St. Francis while he drew away in retreat as he wrote this rule. And so he did, and he came out, he wrote the rule, and then they talked about it, discussed it, and worked on it together. And there was one moment where St. Francis asked, "Brother Leo, tell me what true joy is." And Brother Leo answered something, and St. Francis said, "No, I'll tell you what true joy is." And he began describing going to Perugia and being told by people that, "Oh, we don't need you," or "Go away." And St. Francis said the ability in that moment to keep peace and to be patient and to still love these people, that's where true joy comes. So it's funny in the moment of where he's being rejected or going against all people, that he will find true joy amongst finding peace and peace with inner peace within himself. And St. Francis' real mission was to rebuild the Church of God. And when he first began, he went to San Damiano, which was he went to a church, and there he saw the San Damiano crucifix, and he heard the voice of God speak to him. And it said, "Rebuild my church." And so St. Francis took that in a very literal way, and he began to rebuild the actual physical church. And he became a kind of like a masonry man, working for free and building the church. But then he realized the deeper call to these words, "Rebuild my church." And this became his real mission, to rebuild the body of Christ. And so then towards the end of his life, in 1224, St. Francis received the stigmata. Now these are the wounds of Christ, and he was the very first person to ever receive the wounds of Christ. And what happened was there was a winged seraphim that appeared to him, and it marked St. Francis on his arms and his chest and on his hands, and they weren't really wounds, but they were actually nails that were made of flesh that were imprinted upon him. he had intolerable pain, and so he ended up telling a few brothers about this, and one of the brothers, Brother Leo, his confessor and his closest one, he told him the whole experience, and he allowed Brother Leo to touch him and touch the wounds and to even wrap them to keep him from the intolerable pain. So St. Francis had this mystical experience, and probably one of the highest mystical experiences ever, because he had the very first stigmata ever. St. Francis is known for peace, and to really and this is seen in the story of the wolf of Gubbio. And there was this wolf that was apparently fighting this town of Gubbio, and they sent a knight to fight the wolf, but the wolf ended up eating the knight. But then St. Francis came, and he convinced the wolf to make peace. And this is really a story that really shows more than just a wolf, but the wolf kind of will symbolize people of power and of fame, people who are ready to take advantage of other people and to trample them over their feet. And St. Francis is really known for turning that all upside down just by his life of simplicity and poverty, and becoming a peaceful man. So even today, there is a statue in Gubbio of the wolf. He also recognized the multiplicity of all Franciscans, and he truly believed that everybody is different, yet everyone should become their authentic self. He never wanted people to be exactly like him in every way, but he wanted them to become who they were. And so one time they asked St. Francis, what is the ideal of the Franciscan? And he begins to name the attributes of each brother. He says a Franciscan is about having generosity of brother so-and-so, or having the meekness of brother and so-and-so. And he began naming each brother and naming an attribute that is especially akin to them, and to really say that that's what it means to become a Franciscan. The motto is to live the gospel. And he was one time they decided to start a nativity. He was the very first person to start a nativity scene, and him and a few brothers, they decided to bring in some oxen and animals and create a little hay scene for the child baby Jesus, and it became the very first nativity scene. He was a reformer. He was challenging the status quo of the day of priests that living in luxury, of people that are trying to attain wealth, and he kind of flipped that on its head and really challenged it in a big way just by the life that he was living. But yet, even though being a reformer, he was also very loyal and obedient, especially to the Pope. And he was recognized that he was a part of the body of Christ. And so he ended up dying on October 3rd. And to this day, there are 18,000 priests and lay brothers that are Franciscans. So I hope you guys enjoyed learning about St. Francis of Assisi. You can go ahead and subscribe for a box of St. Francis. Also, if you subscribe for a box of St. Francis, we will send you, as one of your gifts, a phone case of St. Francis of Assisi. So just let us know. If you subscribe in the next week, then we will send you a phone case of St. Francis. So I hope you guys enjoyed learning about St. Francis of Assisi. And I'm Patrick Pulis. I'm the founder of Saint of the Month, and I enjoy learning about the saints with you and teaching you guys all I can about the saints. And I hope you guys have a spiritual impact on your life, and that you may grow in holiness, and that you too may become a saint one day. So God bless you, and I'm praying for you guys. And just send me a shout out anytime you want to say something. I would love to hear from you guys. Any prayer intentions, or just what you guys think of the Saint of the Month, or any ideas for improvement, or even ideas for future saints that we should do. So let us know, and subscribe at www.saintofthemonth.com. God bless.